You open the medicine cabinet, spot a cold tablet strip that expired 3 months ago, and hesitate, as if the exact date printed on the box were the moment chemistry suddenly changed its rules. That way of thinking is extremely common, very convenient for manufacturers, and not really how most medicines age in the real world. Most drugs do not cross their expiration date and instantly turn toxic. What usually happens is far less dramatic. The active ingredient gradually loses strength, more like a battery running low than a switch flipping into danger mode. That is why an expiration date is often not the moment a medicine has gone bad, at least not in the way many people imagine. It is the point up to which a pharmaceutical company is still willing to guarantee that the product meets the standards stated on the label. Put simply, it is a legal boundary before it is a biological one. To understand why the pharmaceutical industry labels drugs this way, you have to look at the question regulators actually ask. They do not require companies to prove how long a drug remains usable under every possible condition. They require companies to prove how long it maintains its quality under tested storage conditions. Those two questions sound similar, but they are separated by an entire mountain of cost and liability. So the expiration date is usually the endpoint of the data range the manufacturer can confidently stand behind. They measure how much of the active ingredient remains, track how the product breaks down, test how well it dissolves, and then choose a date conservative enough to print on the label. If they have strong data for 3 years, they print 3 years. Stretching that number to 5 years requires more studies and more money. Meanwhile, a shorter shelf life keeps purchasing cycles moving more regularly. That is the ordinary logic of an industry that fears lawsuits and appreciates steady revenue. The picture becomes clearer when you look at the U.S. Military's SLEP project, short for the Shelf Life Extension Program. Its background was extremely practical. The military stores enormous quantities of medicine for emergencies, and replacing everything simply because of the printed date is a very fast way to burn through a budget. Instead of guessing, they took expired drugs from tightly controlled storage and tested them again. The results shook the common belief that an expiration date is an absolute life-or-death line. Across multiple rounds of evaluation, most of the drugs in the program remained acceptably stable long after the date printed on the package. Many still retained about 90% of their potency after years, and some cases extended for more than a decade. 15 years sounds more like the age of an old car than the age of a pill. That does not mean every medicine at home should be kept until you forget when you bought it. It simply shows that the manufacturer no longer guarantees it, and the drug is no longer usable, are two very different statements. Chemically speaking, most medicines age in a rather boring way. Heat, moisture, oxygen, and light gradually break down the active molecules, which means the drug slowly becomes weaker. Entropy, here, is simply the tendency of an ordered system to become less ordered over time. For dry tablets, that process is often slow. A pill dropping from 100% to 90% potency does not become poisonous. It merely becomes a weaker version of itself. That means the real risk is usually not some sudden transformation, but the fact that the user believes they are receiving a full dose when in reality they are getting only part of it. With pain relievers, the consequence may be nothing more than reduced effectiveness. With drugs that require precise dosing to control a serious condition, that decline becomes much more important. The key point is to pull this discussion out of label superstition and put it back where it belongs: molecular stability and storage conditions. Of course, not everything in the medicine cabinet deserves that level of leniency. Some exceptions demand real caution. Insulin is a familiar example. Because it is a sensitive protein, even a small structural change can make its effect unreliable. Nitroglycerin is also fragile. because people depend on it to act quickly and clearly in situations where there is no room for guesswork. Some liquid medications, eye drops, reconstituted antibiotics, and biologic products also require far more caution than dry tablets sitting quietly in a blister pack. Part of the answer has nothing to do with chemistry at all. It comes from psychology. Humans are extremely sensitive to clear boundaries. A printed date feels absolute. It creates a sharp line between safe and unsafe. Even when reality is far more gradual, your brain prefers certainty over nuance, even if that certainty is slightly misleading. So when you read expired, your mind doesn't interpret it as possibly a bit weaker. It interprets it as no longer acceptable. That reaction is not irrational. It is efficient. But efficiency often trades accuracy for simplicity. And in this case, the simplicity hides a more subtle truth. Medicine doesn't obey calendar dates. It obeys chemistry, environment, and time. A tablet stored in a cool, dry place ages very differently from one left in a humid bathroom. Heat accelerates molecular breakdown. Moisture can trigger chemical reactions. Light can degrade sensitive compounds. In other words, two identical boxes of medicine with the same printed expiration date can age at completely different speeds depending on how they were treated, which leads to a slightly uncomfortable realization. The date on the package is not really about your specific box of medicine. It is about an average expectation under controlled conditions. And your home is not a controlled laboratory. This is where the idea of storage becomes far more important than most people realize. A blister pack kept sealed protects tablets from air and humidity. A bottle opened repeatedly allows small amounts of moisture inside every time. Over months or years, those tiny exposures accumulate, not dramatically, but steadily. And that steady change is exactly how most drugs decline. Quietly, predictably, almost boringly. There is no dramatic moment, no visible signal, no sudden shift, just a slow drift from full strength to something slightly less. Which brings us back to the real risk. Not toxicity, but assumption. If you take a medication believing it delivers a full dose, but it has degraded to, say, 80 or 90% of its original potency, the effect may not match your expectation. For mild conditions, that difference might barely matter. For situations that depend on precision, it can. And that's where the expiration date quietly regains its importance. Not as a hard biological cutoff, but as a safety margin designed to avoid uncertainty, because uncertainty in medicine is often more dangerous than imperfection. There's also another layer that rarely gets discussed: trust. Pharmaceutical systems rely heavily on trust between manufacturers, regulators, and users. A clearly defined expiration date is a way to standardize that trust. It tells you, up to this point, we are confident. Beyond that point, the responsibility subtly shifts toward you. And that shift is uncomfortable. Because now the question is no longer, is this safe? But how safe is it? Really? And humans are not particularly good at answering that kind of question in everyday life. So we default back to the printed number. Simple, clear, reassuring, even if it's only part of the story. Which is why the most reasonable way to think about expiration dates isn't to ignore them, and not to fear them either. They are signals, guidelines, conservative estimates built on tested data, not absolute reflections of reality. And once you see them that way, the medicine cabinet starts to feel a little less like a ticking clock, and a little more like what it actually is: a collection of chemical tools, each aging at its own quiet pace. Some fragile, some surprisingly resilient, all following the same rule that governs everything else in the physical world. Change doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens slowly, molecule by molecule, long before any label tells you it has begun. And the next time you hesitate in front of an expired package, you might pause for a different reason, not just to check the date, but to ask a better question: what really changed, and how much does it matter?